Okay, so we just learned about the evolutionary history of humanity, and we put a little asterisk on it that's like, oh, let's be careful with that because that has been used to do not nice things before. Okay, so now let's humanize this context a little bit, which means we're going to look at the bigger context of evolution and what that means on a human scale. So, right, evolution. What does this have to do with all of us again? In particular, I love this diagram because it highlights once again the point that I was making earlier, which is that the action of evolution is actually one that leads to diversity, right? And the other cool thing is that layers of evolution can coexist simultaneously. So just because an earlier version of an adaptation later led to particular differences in an evolved sense doesn't mean that the earlier thing just disappeared, right? Like worms still exist and starfish and amoebas. So what we're actually doing is we're looking at the diversity of life that still exists all together at the same time on this planet, and we're trying to figure out how we could have all spontaneously come to exist on this planet. So let's talk a little bit about the evolution of the nervous system. And we're going to talk about it in a human sense, but I wanted to use this diagram of the non-human nervous system as it evolved over time to point out once again that so many of these things continue to coexist, right? So it starts with a very simple nerve cluster and then over time becomes more complex, right? It solidifies and then it branches out and diversifies its functions, and then each organism gets increasingly complex based on how complex their nervous system is. But that doesn't mean that everything is humans now, right? All of these creatures still continue to exist, and we're just projecting that they are at different stages in this bigger picture of how the world came to be how it is, right? So they evolved earlier, but that doesn't mean that they are, it does mean they're less evolved, but it doesn't mean that they're somehow inferior because they continue to survive. So we see layers of this in the human nervous system and in its evolution in particular. And this lecture is going to be about how we operate as human beings. And in particular, we're going to talk about the things that we all share in common because these things that we share go into how we create culture. Okay? So hang with me here if you're not a science person. If you're a science person, get excited because this is going to get real nerdy. So the most primitive form of the human nervous system is called the vagus nerve. And its most primitive piece is actually the unmyelinated sheath. But there's also the myelinated sheath. And that just makes a difference in how fast messages travel along this nerve. So the vagus nerve stretches all the way from, it's a cranial nerve, all the way from the top down through the center of your body. And specifically, it's not like a spinal nerve, man. It is, guys, sorry, y'all, it goes into your viscera. In fact, I think this image is like the best thing. So there is literally a secondary nervous system happening in your viscera, your internal organs, that is not just receiving messages from the brain, but is sending information back to the brain. And it's a more diffuse nervous system, and we are just beginning to understand how it works. But this is one of the reasons why they're like, oh, gut bacteria totally does affect mental health because those parts of your bodies are connected, and they are connected by the oldest and therefore most established, most core, most fundamental part of our nervous system. This is the part that keeps us functional. Like this keeps us alive. That's its function. And what happens in a situation of trauma is that this nervous system, its only like survival mechanism, its only adaptation mechanism is to like shut shit down, right? and make sure that your vital organs continue to function. So the rest of your body will shut down. That's the fold, freeze, trauma response. And so if you are an evolutionary being at this stage where this is your nervous system, your trauma response is fold or freeze, because that is the best chance that you have for survival in the face of a threat. Now, interestingly enough, the evolution of the human nervous system happens to also mirror the cognitive development of individual humans from in utero to functioning adult or relatively functioning adult. So what this means is as your nervous system is starting to form in utero, like before you are you are a clump of cells, and it starts forming this very primitive nervous system that is based around your vagus nerve. And so that little critter inside of a uterus is able to do the same kinds of functioning that a creature with only a vagus style of nerve can do, right? So that's a thing. But the next level, we are more complex beings than just a clump of cells with a it's not a nervous system yet. It's not a spine, but it's just like a central elongated clump of nervous cells. And I forgot what it's called. Anyway, not important. This is a humanities class. So you're all going to forgive me for that. The next stage of our human evolution included the autonomic nervous system. So as beings get more complex, they have more systems that need run. And that's where the autonomic nervous system comes in. In a human being, that's divided into two things, right? There's the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic. And the only key thing that I want everybody to remember from this is that the sympathetic is responsible for your fight or flight. It's your survival system. And the parasympathetic is responsible for your rest and digest. So it's your like maintenance system, right? And the thing is, only one of them can operate at a time. So if you, as a primitive autonomic being, experience a threat at this stage, rather than what you would have done if you were at the vagus nerve stage, you don't fold or freeze, you fight or flight. And that is one of our trauma responses as a human being as well, which is that you will shut down all the blood to your internal organs and all of your rest and digest functions in order to pump it all out into your limbs and fill your body with adrenaline and other stress hormones, especially cortisol, so that you can do one of two extraordinary things in order to escape, a saber-toothed tiger. You can either fight the tiger or flee the tiger. One of those is going to be your best bet at survival. And as long as your sympathetic nervous system is in control, your rest and digest system is offline, not happening. One of the things that happens with trauma is that because we don't end up getting to like flee the saber-toothed tiger and then experience that relief of safety. Oh my God, I did not get eaten today. That would turn off the sympathetic system and turn on the rest and digest. Right? Because we don't experience that relief from the end of the threat, either because it's trauma or because we live a life of chronic stress, one of the two, that means that our rest and digest function ends up out of whack a lot of the time, largely because we can't seem to turn off the sympathetic nervous system with the high heart rate, the hypertension, the increased adrenaline and cortisol, which BT dubs will also make you gain weight, because the only chronic threat that your body can understand on an evolutionary scale is like, hey, I'm still stressed, which means it must not be a saber-toothed tiger. It must be a famine. I should save these calories for later because otherwise I might die. So if you happen to have a few extra pounds, you can just say, I'm not fat. I'm evolved. All right. My body is trying to preserve my life for the oncoming famine. It's fine. So that's how all of these systems work. And once again, let me relate this back to what we're doing. So what that means in human development terms is that early in infancy, even before birth, a fetus is susceptible to trauma because it will impact the development of that nervous system and how it responds. So a pre-birth trauma can cause a fetus to develop a more hypervigilant nervous system because in that stage where it is just like a vagus nerve and nothing else, the vagus nerve is not capable of complex thought and being like, oh, now I'm safe, me, this undifferentiated cluster of cells. It can't do that, right? So it experiences a threat and it puts into place survival mechanisms to survive that threat. And then those are wired in for pretty much ever. I mean, not totally, but some of the things that can impact an infant at this stage include premature birth and or separation from the gestator, right? Like the gestator was a literal life support system. And so when the infant is separated from the gestator, like birth itself is almost traumatic in that sense. But if you are then not able to stay with that source of life, that becomes extraordinarily stressful. Some of the literature about adoption will really talk about how to deal with that trauma of separation at that age. So that's a real physiological thing that people experience. And when they experience trauma at this age, the only thing that their nervous system is capable of doing, because they are not capable of complex thought, they're not rational, and they're not able to like live without a caregiver, is they have a vagal response of fold or freeze. So trauma at this age leads to a default trauma response of folding or freezing. Because the only thing in as close to rational thought as you could potentially project onto a preverbal infant, the only thing that they can understand if they are cut off from their gestator or their source of safety, they then believe that they are going to die, right? And so if you have a secure infant that never experiences that, then they develop confidence and they go out into the world. If, however, they are traumatized at this stage, then not only do they develop a particular trauma response, but they also develop a default belief about the world that it is unsafe, right? The other thing that's going on at this stage is co-regulation, which is that the gestator's nervous system is still intertwined with the infant's developing nervous system. Like they literally are still connected even though they are physically separate. And it's very weird. I have a toddler and it's still like a thing. But early on, they're like not actually separate people. They're kind of, they have like separate bodies, but they're not totally separate people. That infant is dependent upon the gestator for its source of life. It is now like a milk producer or at least a caregiver. And on top of that, the caregiver's nervous system is what tells the infant whether or not it is safe, right? The infant's nervous system is not complex enough to know this. But the caretaker's is, and so the infant is entirely tied to their caretaker's nervous system. So their ability to turn off their fear or the fight or flight system, the caretakers, will signal to the infant whether or not things are safe, right? And all you need is for one of those caregivers to be consistent and non-threatening and reliably meet that child's needs. Here's the other interesting part of that. I'm going to pull up the rest of these bullets, but here's the other interesting part of that is that because our first mechanism of survival is after birth is eating, the connection in mammals to the milk producing gestator or surrogate is primary, right? If you get separated from your source of food, then once again, you're like, oh, I might die. I am starving. Which means if you flip that around, you're like, okay, so that's evolutionarily makes sense. Okay. If you flip that around into like today's childhood development, it means that the feeding relationship between a caregiver and a new infant is the earliest social relationship that exists. like at all. And that means, excuse me, my lips are very chapped. That means that this can go one of two ways. Either infants can have a feedback loop with their caregiver where they're like, oh, I feel this terrible thing, hunger, I might die of it. And so they start screaming and crying. Or if you're an attuned caregiver and you notice that they have pre-crying hunger cues, right? So like my daughter used to go, right? She just used to make this face and this gesture with her mouth. And then there was like this lead up. So by the time you got to crying, she was actually way past hungry. But the point being, if when the kid is hungry, the kid's needs are met, the kid starts to associate, oh, hunger then also means person with food. Excellent. That's good. And if you repeat this cycle often enough, they start to associate hunger with pleasure, because now it's hunger, food from this person, satiation. Then hunger's back, and the better their memory is, the quicker they get to the, oh, but I am hungry now, but soon I shall be satiated. And that makes me happy and sleepy, right? So that becomes a feedback cycle. And then the last stage of this is they're like, oh, hunger, satiation is coming. And that lovely feeling of being satiated is provided by this human. You're all right, human. Okay, I think I shall keep you. That is a part of this cycle. So our earliest understanding of social relationships comes from having those hunger cues met in a timely and consistent fashion. That is how we learn, not only are we not going to die, we're going to survive. I'm going to get through this. I'm going to get fed. No big deal. We also learn, hey, people, not so bad. They help each other out. Unless that is not an infant's experience, in which case they end up developing a sense of mistrust. So the first infant that is fed reliably and consistently, they develop a sense of trust in other people, in the world. But infants who miss all of that, right? So I'm hungry. Nobody's paying attention. Nobody's hearing my cues. I'm going to cry to see if I can get somebody's attention. Nobody's paying attention and nobody's hearing my cues. That sucks. So now I'm going to die is the thought. Well, as much as we can attribute thoughts to preverbal infants, I'm going to die. But also, sometimes that woman or that person provides food and I feel much better. But sometimes they don't. And I never know when it's going to be. So I can't trust anyone to actually fulfill my needs. Right? So what happens to us at this stage directly impacts the way that we human in the world later on, because it lays the foundations for how we view the world and our place in it. So co-regulation, this early stage of development. The next thing that evolves in human evolutionary history, but also the young child, is the limbic system, or the emotional brain. So it's not that your brain isn't all there when you're born, it's that these parts of your brain are not all fully functional yet. They're there, but they're like taking time after delivery to like finish setup, right? So in another sense, what this means for humans is they now can start to use, on like an evolutionary scale, they can start to use their emotions to understand their survival patterns. This leads to socialization and the realization, or maybe not even conscious realization, but the action that humans who are able to socially organize survive better than humans who don't. So being able to understand each other through emotional cues becomes an evolutionary adaptation. This is very hard for us to actually develop in our lived lives. So the next phase of development, when we get a human who has grown through. They're like, okay, I'm going to be safe. I'm going to be fine. My vagal system is working. My parasympathetic and my sympathetic are in balance. And now we're trying to get the limbic system hooked up. And boy, is that a hot mess, says this resident toddler parent. Toddlerhood is specifically difficult because suddenly we are capable of feeling feelings, but we are not yet capable of regulating them. What the fuck? Right? Like, it's very, very overwhelming. So you start to individuate and separate from your caregiver. Complete that process. And you start to know the difference between I need this, which is like food, versus I want this. So prior to this moment, everything you wanted was something you needed, like food for survival or a clean diaper so your butt didn't get all red and chafed. Sorry, that was probably TMI. But at this point, you're like, no, now I want a horsey or a chocolate bunny gram or a dinosaur cracker, which is not a thing that exists, nor have we ever fed it to this toddler, and yet she insists that that is what she needs, a dinosaur cracker. If anybody can help me to find a dinosaur cracker, please do. But the key thing about this is it leads to a new experience altogether, which is like, wait. There's something that I want and you're not going to give it to me? Excuse me? That's never happened before, because before everything you wanted was something you needed and I had to give it to you. Sorry, now I'm like talking to my toddler. But they still don't have rationality, right? Like, that's not here yet. So they have all these feelings and they have no rational brain to help them contextualize it or figure out how it works, or that it's going to be okay, or that this feeling is going to pass. My daughter, after she gets really dysregulated and she gets through to the other side, she'll take a deep breath and go, feel better. Right? So she's learning that we get to that place where we feel better, but that's not always available to her in like these moments, right? Which is like literally things like this kid is crying for putting the used diaper in the trash can, or I won't let her wear her dirty underwear as a hat. Those things are happening in my household right now. And in order to cope with this emotional upheaval, we need social and emotional learning. That's all we're capable of at this point. We are not capable of rationality. So we have to have safe, calm, co-regulation, right? That entangled nervous system from our caregivers. If the toddler tantrum stresses out the caregiver to the point where the caregiver snaps and they're not regulated, then the toddler doesn't feel safe and the whole situation escalates. Then you get to stage 2 development at this point, which is autonomy versus shame and self-doubt. So if you are responded to, you're allowed to feel your feelings and then get to the point where you feel better. Then you start to learn, I am self-sufficient. I can soothe myself. If, however, someone always steps in to try and make you feel better or fix something for you or help you with something that you can do yourself, then you start to believe that you are not capable. So this is also the age where we develop beliefs about ourselves having to do with shame and control and responsibility. Naturally, if you developed with autonomy and an attuned caregiver, you're like, I'm okay. I don't have to control everything because the grown-ups are gonna make sure everything works out fine. And I can trust people to do that, right? I don't have to control everything because most things are fine. And I'm not responsible for things because grown-ups are taking care of things that are too big for me, right? And children who suffer trauma, abuse, or neglect at this age, they develop the inverse beliefs, which is I am bad. I deserve whatever maltreatment I'm getting. I have to control the environment because if I don't, something bad is going to happen if I'm not in control. And finally, I'm responsible for everything, which is a huge burden to carry when you're 2, because 2-year-olds cannot feed the family. They cannot provide a home or a stable environment or whatever. But if they feel like that's their responsibility and they don't have a stable home environment, they A, feel like they are failing, and B, they can't trust anyone else to provide that safety and nourishment that they need. And then we get to the next age, which is preschool, right? So now we have actual independent human beings, and they're starting to learn how to manage their emotions, assuming they had a safe, attuned environment. Uh-oh. I have a dysregulated toddler waking up from a nap. I can hear it. And at this stage, if they've developed this far, they also start to develop initiative, right? They start to set their own goals and accept their own selves. Those who do not experience this safe, attuned environment end up having guilt instead of initiative. Right? Because everything they try seems to somehow fail. And therefore, they believe I do bad things. Right? So we went from I'm going to die to I am bad to I do bad things. And then we reach the age of emotional regulation. Right? So older kids, older elementary kids start to actually develop the ability to control their emotions. And the question becomes, what do they use them for? Or what have they been used for thus far? Right? So at this age, we all start to compare ourselves to each other. And when we feel like we come out okay in that comparison, we develop confidence and self-esteem. When we have an unsatisfactory comparison, we then start to develop a sense of inferiority, and that usually comes with judgment, right? So if we start to compare ourselves to other people and we're like, oh yeah, I'm doing all right, we're fine. But if we feel like we're not doing all right, then usually we have been given the language of judgment from someone external to indicate to us that something is not fine about us. And that's where that developing sense of inferiority comes from. Here, core beliefs about ourselves overlap some of those previous stages. I do bad things versus versus I can accept myself. But in this case, it's I do bad things or I am not as good as someone else. Whereas the attuned and secure development leads to the higher order of I can accept who I am. Okay, I had to take a brief break because my dysregulated toddler was in need of some attention. So we will return here to the age of 7. That is where we become aware of our own vulnerability in a cognitive way, right? Earlier on, we may have had some instinctive development of our vulnerability if our needs were not met. But now, even if our needs were met, we suddenly become aware of the possibility that things could have gone otherwise or could go, right? So lessons from our environment teach us our core beliefs about vulnerability. So if we have safety and support throughout our early childhood, as well as we develop initiative and autonomy, this leads us to the belief, I can protect myself. If we don't have those things, this then leads us to the belief, I'm vulnerable. Like I am generally not safe in the world and there's nothing I can do about it, right? That's a heavy burden for a child the age of 7. Now we bring in the big player. So this is both the last part of the human nervous system to develop in evolutionary history, and it is the last part of the nervous system to develop as we are growing, and that is the cortex. This big gray matter part, the wrinkly part of your brain, that is where the higher processing happens, right? And that is developing as we go along, but it's really not the primary system until we get to at least age 7. And the higher processing, the part that we really depend on for executive functioning, cognitive thought, being able to take control of our decisions instead of act on instinct, that actually comes from the prefrontal cortex, a very particular part of the cortex. So during adolescence, our cortex is evolving, and our prefrontal cortex in particular. And one of the key things that's going on in adolescence is we're now starting to understand ourselves as completely separate human beings, right? So we get into identity versus role confusion situations. In a successful adolescence, we have a clear sense of self. We establish our internal values, morals, ethics, like we have our own compass. And if we have a weak sense of self, then we might struggle to break away from what other people expect of us, right? And that can lead to cycles of codependence or abuse, which is a less than ideal outcome. In the West, where we prioritize or highly value independence, adolescence ends with total self-sufficiency of the individual in early adulthood, right? So once you are no longer dependent on others. Not every culture values that kind of self-sufficiency. And in that case, adolescence ends when individuals take on roles of trust or responsibility within their community. So the prefrontal cortex, though, we got to drill down on this because this is the part of the brain that runs all of your executive functioning, right? It helps you to balance short-term rewards versus long-term goals, impulse control, delayed gratification, moderate your intense emotions, adjust your behavior when necessary, weighing consequences, considering the future, right? Focus. All of those things are part of your prefrontal cortex. You need your prefrontal cortex to be fully functional and operative in order to do all of those things. And it does not finish developing until 25. That's right. Most of y'all still do not have a fully functioning prefrontal cortex. And sometimes you might need to make some considerations for yourself given that. So these things all line up with, and this is the end of this section, this mini lecture, these all line up with our needs as humans, right? So Maslow's hierarchy of needs is commonly introduced in like a psychology class. But what we see here is that the same thing that's built into our nervous system from the most foundational component, the most evolutionarily oldest foundational part, from that part all the way up to the most complex, that actually mirrors how we function in the world, right? So Maslow's hierarchy of needs articulates that we have to first meet our foundational needs down here at the bottom, our physiological and then safety needs, before we can move on up to self-actualization and these higher order needs, right? So let's look at this. The physiological portion of this pyramid. Let's look back, right? Breathing, food, water, sex, sleep, homeostasis, functioning bowels. That's all super, super automatic. And we have to meet those needs before we can do anything else. And those are the needs that are regulated by the vagus nerve and the parasympathetic nervous system, right? That vagus nerve and the rest and digest function. Once you've met those physiological needs, you're fed, you're rested, you have shelter and clothing, you're like not freezing to death, then you can look at the next most urgent category of needs, which are safety needs, right? The security of your body. For us in modern society, it includes financial security. It means the security of your health, your family, right? And the places that you occupy. Those are regulated by your autonomic nervous system. Generally, your fight and flight and your rest and digest. That feeling of safety is deeply programmed into how our nervous system functions. Excuse me, hang on. Sorry. You're just getting a show today. Only once we both meet our physiological needs and we feel safe can we then turn to these higher order needs and trying to get those met. So the next order is the love and belonging needs. That's friendship, family, intimacy, those things that put you in relation to your community. Those are regulated by your limbic system, right? The part of your brain that regulates your emotions, that social interaction, that's all part of that system. So we literally have to like we have to meet our physiological needs, have a snack, have a nap, drink some water, put on a sweater, and then look around and be like, oh, it's safe. Nobody here is going to harass me. And then we have to feel connected to other human beings, after which we are able to look at these much more high order needs, which is the esteem, having confidence in ourselves, feeling like we've achieved something, respect from other people, respecting other people. If we don't meet those, if we haven't met any of our other needs, like our more basic needs, we can't even get to this level, right? This happens in the cortex, right? So we have to have a regulated vagus nerve. We have to have a regulated autonomic nervous system. We have to have a regulated limbic system, and we have to get a functioning cortex before we can even begin to talk about self-actualization, like the highest, most transcendent state of our being as humans. We can't get there unless everything else is in order. And that morality, creativity, spontaneity, problem solving, accepting facts, overcoming our internal prejudices, that all happens up here in the highest order. And it is governed by our prefrontal cortex, which is not finished developing until 25, right? So some key lessons about this, and I'm pretty sure this is where we end this section. Yep. Some key lessons about this we should be applying to our own lives right now, right? Which is, we are all living through an unprecedented crisis. Like, yes, there have been plagues and flus before, but have they demanded the same things of us? Not exactly. So what you're trying to do right now in this class, watching this video that I am making, you're trying to use your prefrontal cortex to tap into this self-actualization sphere, right? And you need to look at your life right now and see if you have all the pieces in place for your nervous system to be able to get engaged at this top level, right? Let's back up. Oop, wrong way. Do you get enough rest, food, exercise? Like, do you move your body? Do you eat well? Do you have a place to sleep? Do you take basic care of your physiological existence? If the answer is no, you have to stop there and meet those needs, right? And it's not like once you meet them, they're always met, right? Every day, all the time, we're on this pyramid fluctuating back and forth. And if we're trying to do something up here and we realize, I need a snack, we have to go eat the snack, or we can't just push through. The thinking that we do is poor thinking. So if you get there and you've got that part regulated, then you have to ask yourself, am I safe where I am? Do I feel safe? Do I feel able to do this? And for some of us, that answer is going to be really complicated because we're living through a pandemic, right? And some political turmoil. So we have to get to a place where we feel safe enough to move to the next level, even though we're all living through a crisis of safety in some sense. So I say this to point out that the conditions under which we are trying to learn are really, really difficult. And it is okay if you don't fall into that self-actualization part of the pyramid all the time. But I will tell you that what I'm going to be asking you to do this semester is going to require that you get yourself up in here as best you can for the times that you are learning with our community, right? Because that's what's going to enable you to think and to process and to learn from one another, to be able to hear other people's perspectives and opinions and be influenced by them, right? And that's really where learning happens, is at this level where you feel safe enough to investigate your own opinions and why you hold them, right? So you're going to need to find a way to have your needs met. And if you need help making sure that they are met, I hope that you will reach out to myself or someone on the teaching staff, because we know how difficult it is to get learning done when you're not, when your other needs aren't met, right? And then the last thing I'm going to say about this, right? You got to move through these stages, but to get here and to stay here means that when you experience something on these lower levels, so if you're here in prefrontal cortex land, learning the things, and then somebody, whoops, I went way the wrong way. Okay, let's try that again. That means that if you're here in prefrontal cortex territory and somebody barges into your apartment and they're like threatening you with a knife, you are way down here, right? You just got popped right out of that creative thinking space, intellectual sphere, and you are now here dealing with safety issues, right? Because your autonomic nervous system, essentially, like if you think of all of the parts of your nervous system as passengers in a car, what you want is the most capable passenger to be doing the driving, right? You want that guy to be driving. Or, if that one's not available, functioning cortex will do. Limbic system, that is road rage driver right there. We don't want them driving. We definitely don't want the toddler or the baby driving. Not a good idea. But what happens if you're not feeling safe, then suddenly the part of your body that deals with safety threats, the fight or flight system, is like, oh my God, guys, I am taking over. And they leap over the seats and they grab the wheel from the prefrontal cortex and they are steering the car. And the prefrontal cortex is like, what are you doing? You don't even have the pedals. You can't even reach. Holy shit. And yes, the whole system careens out of control until you calm that toddler down. Oh my gosh, this really reflects my life. You must calm the toddler down before you can do anything else. Personal lessons from this lecture. But that's the key, right? So please be kind to yourselves this semester. Know that what you are attempting to do is in fact an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. And what we're here to do as your teaching team is to help you to occupy that space. Now, we are going to take that information and we're going to apply it to the cultures that we're studying. How does each culture meet its people's needs? But it's okay if we pause here to take time to evaluate, how am I meeting my needs right now? So pause, take some time to do that. This is the third and final portion of this lecture, which should be pretty fun, pretty short. Decolonizing the human.